Hey there. In our previous discussions, we spent a lot of time delving into the minds of consumers. We explored how they make choices, how those choices are influenced by prices, incomes, and even through government policies. But now it's time to switch gears and explore the other side of the market, the firms. Think of firms as the engines of the economy. They are the ones who take inputs, things like labor, capital, raw materials, and transform them into the goods and services we all want and need, right? But how do they make these decisions? How do they decide what to produce and how much to produce? Well, that's exactly what we're going to uncover in this session. So, what's on the agenda for this session? Get ready to dive deep into the inner workings of firms. We'll start by exploring what exactly a firm is and how economists think about those tricky concepts of opportunity cost and profit. But we won't stop there. First, we'll analyze the short run where firms have to make decisions with some constraints. Think limited factory space or a fixed number of machines. Then, we'll dissect the different types of costs that firms face in the short run. Why do some costs stay the same while others vary with output? And how do these costs behave as production increases? Understanding these cost dynamics is crucial for figuring out how firms decide how much to produce. Finally, we'll shift our focus to the long run, where firms have more flexibility to adjust their inputs. Think expanding factories, hiring more workers, or adopting new technologies. It's a whole new world of possibilities. Okay, let's dive right in, right? When we hear the word firm, we often picture a massive corporation with skyscrapers and thousands of employees. But in reality, firms can be anything from a solo freelancer working from their kitchen table to a global conglomerate with operations spanning continents. Regardless of size, the essence of a firm always remains the same. It's an organization that transforms inputs, things like labor, capital, and raw materials, and converts them into outputs, the goods and services that we all consume. Now, here's where things get interesting. Accountants and economists have slightly different perspectives on how to measure a firm's profits. Accountants, with their keen eye for detail, focus on explicit costs. Okay, these are the direct out-of-pocket expenses that a firm incurs, like rent, wages, and the cost of materials. They are the tangible costs that show up on a firm's financial statements. But economists take a broader view. They also consider implicit costs. These are the opportunity costs of the resources that the firm's owners contribute to the business. For example, an entrepreneur might forego a salary they could have earned working elsewhere, or they might use their own savings to fund the business, missing out on the interest they could have earned elsewhere. These implicit costs, while not directly paid out, represent real sacrifices made by the owners. So why do economists care about these implicit costs? Because to truly understand a firm's decision making, we need a complete picture of profitability. We need to consider both explicit and implicit costs to see if a firm is truly earning a return that justifies the risks and sacrifices that are involved. Okay? Now don't get me wrong, accounting profits are still very, very important. You definitely don't want to mess with the tax authorities by ignoring these explicit costs. But in the realm of economics, when we talk about profits, we are usually referring to economic profits, which take those implicit costs into account. It's a subtle but very crucial distinction. Alright, let's talk about time. When it comes to making production decisions, the time frame matters a lot. Economists often distinguish between the short run and the long run. So what's the short run? It's a period where at least one key input to production is fixed. Think of it like this. Imagine a bakery that suddenly sees a huge increase in demand for its delicious croissants. In the short run, they might be able to bake a few extra batches or hire a couple more bakers, but they can't magically expand their kitchen overnight, right? Their oven capacity, the size of their workspace, those things are fixed in the short run. But the long run is a different story. Given enough time, that bakery could invest in a bigger oven, expand their kitchen, or even open a second location. In the long run, all inputs become variable. They have much more flexibility to adjust to these changes in demand. Why is this distinction so important? Well, it fundamentally shapes how firms respond to market forces. In the short run, they have to make do with what they have. They might have to turn away customers or make tough choices about which products to prioritize. But in the long run, they have more options. They can expand, contract, or even completely reinvent themselves. So whether it's a bakery facing a croissant craze or a tech company responding to a surge in demand for its latest gadget, understanding the difference between the short run and the long run is crucial for understanding how firms navigate the ever-changing economic landscape. Okay, so we know firms transform inputs into outputs, but how exactly does that magical transformation happen? That's where the production function comes in. Think of the production function as a recipe, right? It tells us the relationship between the ingredients, which are the inputs, and the final dish, which is the output. Just like a recipe tells us how much flour, sugar, and eggs you need to bake a cake, the production function tells a firm how much labor, capital, and raw materials are needed to produce, say, a car or a smartphone, right? Okay. Now remember that crucial distinction between the short run and long run. Well, it applies to inputs as well. In the short run, some inputs are fixed, they can't be easily changed, like the size of a factory or the number of specialized machines a firm has. Okay? These fixed inputs are like the oven in our bakery example. You can't just make it bigger overnight. Okay? But other inputs are variable. They can be adjusted more quickly, right? Like the number of workers or the amount of raw materials used. Okay? These are like the ingredients in our cake recipe. You can easily add a bit more flour or sugar if needed, right? Okay. Understanding the production function and this fixed variable distinction is like having an X-ray vision into a firm's operations. It allows us to see how efficiently they are using their resources and how they can adjust their production in response to changes in demand or costs. Okay. It's a fundamental building block for understanding how firms make those critical production decisions. Okay, so we know that firms use inputs to create outputs, and we have that production function to describe that relationship, right? But how can we analyze how those inputs actually affect the amount of output produced, especially in the short run when some inputs are fixed? Well, economists have developed a few key measures to help us understand this. Let's break them down. Okay. First up, we have the total product of labor, or TPL for short. This is the most straightforward measure, right? It simply tells us the total amount of output produced at different levels of labor. Okay? Think of it as the grand total of everything the firm produces with a given number of workers, right? Okay. Next, we have the marginal product of labor, or MPL. Okay. This one's really important, right? It tells us how much extra output we get by adding one more unit of labor. Okay, imagine you hire one more worker in your factory. How much does your total output increase? That's your MPL. Okay, it's like measuring the productivity boost from that extra worker. Okay, finally, we have the average product of labor, or APL. This measures the output per worker on average. Okay. It gives us a sense of the overall productivity of the workforce. Now, these three measures, TPL, MPL, and APL, are all interconnected. Okay, they paint a picture of how a firm's production process works in the short run when things like factory size or machinery are fixed. Okay, let's talk about one of the most fundamental principles in economics, the law of diminishing returns. It sounds a bit intimidating, but it's actually a pretty intuitive concept, and these numbers will help us see it in action. Essentially, it says that if we keep adding more and more of a variable input, like labor, to a fixed input, like the size of a factory, eventually the extra output we get from each additional unit of that variable input will start to decrease. Think of it like this. Imagine a small pizza shop with just one oven. That oven is their fixed input in the short run. Okay, they can't magically make it bigger on a whim, right? Now, let's say that they start hiring more and more workers. This table shows exactly how their pizza production changes as they add staff, right? Okay, with no workers, they produce 0 pizzas, right? That makes sense. Okay, with one worker, let's say they can make 5 pizzas. Okay, adding a second worker boosts production to, let's assume that it's 17 pizzas. Okay, that's a big jump, right? And with the third worker, they crank out 32 pizzas. Initially, adding those extra workers might make a big difference, right? One person alone can only do so much, right? Okay, but with a team, they can divide tasks, they can specialize and become much more efficient. However, as they keep hiring, the gains start to slow down. Look at what happens when they go from 3 to 4 workers. The increase in pizzas is smaller than before. Okay, and with the 5th worker, they only add 8 more pizzas. Okay, the kitchen might be getting crowded now, right? Workers might start getting in each other's way, and there might be too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. Eventually, adding even more workers might actually decrease the output. Look at what happens with 7 workers. Okay, they actually make fewer pizzas than with 6 workers. Okay, imagine 10 people trying to work in a tiny kitchen with one oven. Chaos, right? Okay, this is the law of diminishing returns in action. At some point, adding more of a variable input to another fixed input leads to smaller and smaller increases in output. It's a principle that applies to all sorts of production processes, from pizza making to software development to farming, etc. Right? It's a reminder that more isn't always better, right? And there's always an optimal balance to be found in the combination of inputs. Okay, so we've talked about those key measures of labor productivity: total product, marginal product, and average product, right? Okay, now let's see how they relate to each other and why that relationship matters for firms. This graph shows the connection between the marginal product of labor, MPL, and the average product of labor, APL. Okay, remember, MPL tells us the extra output we get from adding one more worker, while APL shows the average output per worker. Okay, now here's where it gets very interesting. Notice how when the MPL curve is above the APL curve is increasing. Why is that? If the latest worker you hire is more productive than the average worker, that pulls the average up, right? Okay. Conversely, when the MPL curve dips below the APL curve also starts to decline. This makes sense too, because if that new worker is less productive than the average, it drags the average down. Okay. And where do these two curves cross? That's the magic point where the average product of labor reaches its peak. It's like finding the sweet spot where you're getting the most output per worker on average. Okay. Now, why should firms care about this? Well, understanding these dynamics can help them make smart decisions about hiring and production in the short run. Okay. If they see that their MPL is starting to decline, it might be a signal that they're approaching that point of diminishing returns. Okay. Hiring more workers might not be the best strategy anymore. Okay. So by keeping an eye on these curves, firms can optimize their workforce and get the most out of their labor input. Okay. It's all about finding the balance between adding more and more workers and maintaining a high level of productivity. All right, we've explored the ins and outs of production in the short run, but now let's talk about the costs involved in bringing these goods and services to life. After all, firms can't just magically conjure products out of thin air, right? Okay. To understand how firms make those crucial production decisions, we need to break down the different types of costs they face. Okay. First up, we have fixed costs. Okay. These are the expenses that stay the same regardless of how much a firm produces. Think of things like rent for the factory, lease payments on equipment, or even the salaries of top management. Okay. Even if the firm decides to take a break and produce absolutely nothing, those fixed costs still have to be paid. Okay. Then we have variable costs. These are the costs that change depending on how much the firm produces. Want to bake more cakes? You need more flour, sugar, and maybe even more bakers, right? Okay. These variable costs increase as productions ramp up, okay, and decrease as production winds down. Okay. Now if we add those fixed and variable costs together, what do we get? Total costs, right? Is the grand total of all the expenses a firm incurs at a given level of production. Okay, but we can dive even deeper. Marginal cost is a super important concept for firms. It tells us the cost of producing just one more unit of output. Think of it like this. If you're already making 100 widgets, how much extra does it cost to make widget number 101, right? Okay, that's your marginal cost. And finally, we have average costs. These give us a per unit perspective. We can calculate average fixed cost or average variable cost or average total cost to see how much each unit of output costs the firm on average. Okay, understanding these different cost categories is very crucial for businesses, right? It helps us understand how they make decisions about how much to produce, what prices to charge, and ultimately how to stay profitable, right? Okay, we've talked about those different cost categories, fixed costs, variable costs, and total costs. Now let's see those costs in action with an example. This table shows the cost figures for our pizza shop as they produce different quantities of pizza. Okay, notice how the total fixed cost stays constant at $15, okay, no matter how many pizzas they produce. Okay, that's because these costs represent things like rent, which don't change in the short run, even if they don't make a single pizza. Okay, but the total variable costs tells a different story, right? They increase as the shop produces more and more pizza. Okay, this makes perfect sense, right? If you want to make more pizza, you'll need more dough, more cheese, more toppings, and even maybe more workers to help you out. Okay, all those extra ingredients and labor add to your variable costs. And how do we get the total costs? Simple, right? We just add the fixed costs to the variable costs. Okay, and our formula, total costs, which is equal to total fixed costs and total variable costs, captures this relationship perfectly, right? Now this chart helps us visualize these cost trends. Notice how the TVC curve starts out relatively flat, but then starts to slope upwards as more pizzas are produced. Okay, this reflects the increasing cost of those additional variable inputs. The more you produce, the more those variable costs eventually start to bite. Okay, and that upward sloping total cost curve, well, that's simply a reflection of those increasing variable costs being added to the constant fixed costs. It's a visual reminder that as production increases, those total costs start to climb. Okay, so we've seen how those total costs behave as our pizza shop produces more and more pizza, right? Okay, but now let's zoom in and analyze those costs on a per unit basis. This table gives us a granular view of the cost structure. Okay, first, the marginal cost column is super important for firms, right? It tells us how much it costs to produce just one more pizza. Notice how it fluctuates. It initially decreases, it gets cheaper to make each additional pizza as we ramp up production, but then it starts to increase. Why is that? Remember that law of diminishing returns? As we add more workers to that fixed kitchen space, things start to get crowded and less efficient, and those marginal costs start to rise. Now let's look at those average costs. Average fixed cost is pretty straightforward. It's simply the fixed cost divided by the number of pizza, right? Okay, notice how it steadily declines as we produce more and more pizza. Okay, we are spreading those fixed costs over a larger and larger number of pizzas, so the per unit fixed cost goes down. Okay, average variable cost often has a U shape. It initially decreases as we become more efficient and spread those variable costs over more pizzas, but then as we hit capacity limits, those variable costs per unit start to creep up again, right? And finally, we have the average total cost, okay, which is the overall cost per pizza. Okay, this is a very crucial number for firms, especially when they're making pricing decisions. Okay, they need to make sure they're charging enough to cover all their costs, right? Okay, Now here's the cool thing, right? These cost measures don't just exist in a table, right? They have a dynamic relationship with each other, which we can see in the graph on the right side, right? Notice how the marginal cost curve intersects both the AVC curve and the ATC curve at their minimum points. Okay, that's not a coincidence, right? Remember how we talked about the marginal cost curve acting like a magnet, pulling those average cost curves down when it's below them and pulling them up when it's above them. This creates that characteristic U shape and those important intersection points. Okay, so this graph gives us a powerful visual representation of how these different cost measures interact and how they can inform a firm's production decisions. All right, let's continue our exploration of these cost curves, right? As we saw in the previous slide, the intersection point between the marginal cost curve and the average cost curves are key. Okay, but why exactly does the marginal cost curve intersect the average variable cost curve and the average total cost curves at their minimum points? Well, let's dive a bit deeper into the logic behind it, right? Let's use the analogy of grades on a test. If you get a really good grade on a test, one that's higher than your current average, what happens to your average now? It goes up, right? Okay. The same principle applies to costs. If the cost of producing one more unit, which is the marginal cost, right, is lower than your average variable cost, it pulls down your average. Okay. But once marginal cost becomes higher than the average variable cost, it starts dragging the average upwards. That's why their intersection marks the minimum point on the average variable cost curve. And the same logic holds true for marginal cost and average total cost too. Okay. Now these intersections aren't just theoretical curiosities, right? They have real world implications for businesses. Understanding these points can help firms make informed decisions about how much to produce and what prices to set in order to achieve their cost minimization goals. Okay. So this chart gives us a powerful tool to visualize and analyze those cost dynamics. All right, we've explored production curves and cost curves separately, right? Now let's put them side by side and see if we can spot any interesting connections. Take a look at these two charts, especially the shapes they form. Okay, notice anything fascinating? It's like looking in a mirror, isn't it? Okay, the chart on the right showing our cost curves is almost an inverted image of the production curves on the left. But why is that? Well, it all comes down to the relationship between productivity and costs, right? Remember how marginal costs tell us how much producing one more unit changes the total cost, and how marginal product of labor tells us how much one extra worker adds to the output. These two are intimately linked. When MPL is high, it means each new worker is contributing a lot to the output. Okay. This means the cost of making those additional units, which is denoted by MC, is relatively low. Okay. But as we start hitting those diminishing returns and MPL declines, the opposite happens for costs, right? Each extra worker adds less and less to the output, which drives up the cost of those extra units. Okay. That's why the MC curve rises as the MPL curve falls. And the relationship between average product of labor and average variable costs follow a similar pattern. Okay, higher average productivity means lower average variable costs. It's like getting more bang for your buck with your labor input, right? This inverse relationship between productivity and costs is a fundamental principle in economics. It's crucial for understanding how firms analyze their operations, make production decisions, and ultimately strive to be as efficient as possible. Okay, so we've spent a good chunk of time exploring costs in the short run, where firms have to deal with those pesky fixed inputs. But what happens when we give them a bit more freedom? What happens in the long run when they can adjust all their inputs? Well, imagine a company that's growing and expanding, right? Each of these short-run ATC curves on the graph represent a different factory size. As the firm expands its capacity, things start to look pretty good, right? They can take advantage of specialization, spread those fixed costs over more units, and they can become more efficient. Okay, notice how the ATC curves are shifting downwards initially. Okay, that's a sign of those lower average costs. But here's the catch. Bigger isn't always better, right? At some point, a firm might become too large and become inefficient. Managing a massive operation can become a real headache, and those pesky diminishing returns might start to creep in again. Okay, that's why we see those ATC curves eventually sloping upwards. Okay, now that long run average total cost curve, or LRAC, is like a roadmap for firms. Okay, it traces the lowest possible cost for each output level when the firm has the flexibility to choose its ideal combination of inputs. Okay, it's like finding that sweet zone of production, not too big, not too small, but just about right. Okay, so why is this important for businesses? Well, it highlights the importance of carefully planning and strategic decision making in the long run. Okay, expanding too quickly or without considering the potential for diseconomies of scale can lead to higher costs and lower efficiency. Okay, it's a reminder that growth needs to be managed strategically to ensure long-term success. Okay, let's wrap up this session with a closer look at how a firm's average costs evolve in the long run. Okay, remember, in the long run, everything is variable. Okay, firms can expand their factories, adopt new technologies, and completely restructure their operations. Okay, this chart shows us the long run average total cost curve, or LRAC. Okay, and it tells a fascinating story about the relationship between firm size and efficiency. Okay, notice how the curve initially slopes downwards. This region represents economies of scale. Okay, as the firm grows, its average cost per unit actually decreases. Okay, why is that? Well, they might be able to specialize their workforce, negotiate better deals with suppliers for buying in bulk, okay, or invest in more efficient machinery, right? It's like getting bigger and better at the same time. Okay. Then we often see a flatter portion in the middle of the curve. This represents constant returns to scale. Here, expanding further doesn't really change the average cost much. Okay. The benefits of getting larger are balanced out by the growing complexity of managing a larger organization. Okay. But eventually, the curve takes a turn upwards. Okay, this signifies diseconomies of scale. Okay, at this point, growing even larger actually makes the firm less efficient, driving up its average costs. Why is that? Well, communication might break down in a massive company, bureaucracy could slow things down, or they might even lose some of their bargaining power with suppliers. Okay, it's like the firm has become too big for its own good. So we've covered a lot of ground in this session. We've explored how firms make production decisions, and we've delved into the cost structures they face in both the short run and the long run. Okay, but why is all this cost analysis so important? Well, it lays the foundation for understanding how firms make pricing and output decisions in different market environments. And that brings us to our next session, where we'll explore the fascinating world of market structures. Okay, we'll discuss how things like the number of competitors, the ease of entering a market, and the type of product being sold create very different playing fields for businesses. Okay, understanding these market structures is key to unlocking the secrets of price determination and how those competitive forces ultimately shape the choices available to us as consumers. See you in the next session. Cheers.